Welcome back to those of us who were here yesterday. I hope you slept well and had a good breakfast for another very stimulating and challenging day today with Ilia. The 2014 TBI Symposium, The Nature of Mind, Science and Buddhism in the 21st Century. Without any further ado, I would like to hand you straight over to Ilia.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you all very much for stepping out of bed on a Sunday morning to attend conferences which are not easy, especially those of you who lasted through yesterday afternoon and still came this morning. Thank you very much indeed. The rest of these conferences will be much more straightforward than the military we covered yesterday. Then, in our process of trying to understand the genesis of materialism, which is the dominant ideology in the West, and to see whether or not this ideology, because that's really what it is grounded, or as grounded as materialist dogmatists would have us believe or not. We covered yesterday, as you remember, a range of initial arguments against materialism, drawn from the private experience of consciousness, the widespread presence of altruism in biology, which is very difficult to justify, pre-verbal ethical reactions in infants between the ages of 3 and 6 months, and finally an argument drawn from linguistics, as you remember, the so-called poverty of stimulus argument, that the amount of data a child receives from its mother in the process of learning a language, let's say English, simply is insufficient for the child to speak correctly. And yet we all know children do speak correctly, actually do speak. Now, those were the initial arguments. And then yesterday afternoon we covered, I would say, the strongest arguments against materialism, unfortunately also by far the most difficult. These are arguments drawn from quantum physics. I had covered them once in the past at TBI, and I used this opportunity to go in much greater depth. As you remember, we spoke of von Neumann's understanding of the wave function, or what is now known currently as a state vector in quantum physics, which describes the behavior of a particle. And the very interesting point this Hungarian physicist von Neumann makes, which is that for the wave function to collapse, in other words, for the particle to actually have definite characteristics, energy, spin, momentum, and whatnot, the consciousness of the observer is indispensable, and this consciousness, according to von Neumann, must be non-material. Now, this has been the main bone of contention in quantum mechanics since the 1930s. As mentioned yesterday, divided quantum mechanics into two broad camps, that of Niels Bohr and Heisenberg on the one hand, and that of von Neumann, Wegener, Fitzwater, and so forth on the other hand. Recent data has come much closer to corroborating von Neumann's intuition. I mentioned yesterday some of the recent studies by Rohracher, which led an American physicist, Richard Korn, and as I mentioned yesterday, people always do this near their retirement, to publish an editorial in Nature stating that the universe was mental. Then all of this is basically data which corroborates quite strongly the core intuitions of all of the Indian schools of philosophy, with perhaps the exception of the ancient Indian materialists. It is not data which specifically corroborates the Buddhist viewpoint. But as we will see later today, certainly the data from quantum mechanics is not compatible with a theistic viewpoint of the world. In other words, it's not compatible with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it is not compatible with materialism either. It is strongly compatible with both Hinduism and Buddhism, and to a lesser degree Jain. So we're coming to a point where one can, based on present scientific knowledge, rationally choose a spiritual tradition which is compatible with what is known. Then today we're going to cover data which counters the materialist viewpoint drawn from medicine, from biology, and from psychiatry. The data is less clear. You will not find the type of powerful data we found in the critique of materialism coming from quantum mechanics. Largely because the disciplines themselves are, well, I always felt when I was young that biology was a muddled discipline. It doesn't have the clarity of mathematics or physics. But there is data, and there is a strong data. And we will try to understand what this data is and what it implies. And then this afternoon, we shall draw all this together. I try to make a synthesis to show you what all the data I have presented implies. There are certain spiritual traditions or even philosophical systems which are vindicated by the data, and some really are at odds with the data. And interestingly enough, the dominant worldview of the West nowadays is at odds with the data. So what you read in the popular press, if you go on Yahoo, if you go on BBC, and it's like every couple of days, scientists discover that, what might it be, if an electron is inserted in this part of the brain, the person is happy, something of that nature. And the implicit subtext is happiness is a product exclusively of the brain, as its own mental activity. This viewpoint is basically at odds with a lot of experimental and theoretical data. And since this causes a lot of problems to our students, who after all come here 2-3 hours a week and are the rest of their time in the world at large, it's very important to present this data. Then the material over these 2 days is basically my personal work. This is my private opinion on the topic. It's the product of more than 30 years really of reflection, but especially the product of the last 6 or 7 years in Australia, where I really found that our students here are confronted with a tension between the spiritual tradition they study on the one hand and what they think science is telling them on the other hand. And it's in trying to bridge this gap that these conferences arose. Now, the goal of these conferences is not to present a complete system of thought to you, if you wish, to conciliate the inconciliable. The goal is instead to trigger your interest. Each one of you will resonate with a different topic. I know, for instance, that Chris, the director of the center, because of his background in palliative care, has resonated very powerfully with the presentation of near-death experiences, and has pursued his own research in the field, which is exactly the goal of these conferences. Others will resonate with cases of the reincarnation type, some with physics. In every case, this is the beginning of your own path. How much you do or do not do is entirely up to you. The bibliographies here, there's one bibliography per conference, are designed to help you to get into the material. Then, because I draw on a large range of material, I'm in the situation of a jack of all trades and a master of none. So if any of you are trained in some of these fields, please forgive me for approximations. But we are at a point where we can no longer just blindly rely on specialists, a bit as the peasants of the Middle Age relied on the priests of the cathedral to impart the living truth. We do have to check this specialist knowledge. And most of us in this room are reasonably well educated. It is something which can be done. Then, without further ado, what is the understanding of the mind-brain relation in biology, medicine, and psychiatry? Well, first we have to understand the position of your opponent before countering him. Basically, I think there was, if you wish, a turning point in that understanding with an event, an accident really, which occurred to a railway foreman in the middle of the 19th century in America, Phineas Gage. Until then, people had this broad and nebulous idea of the mind as somehow related but separate from the brain. And Phineas Gage was a victim of a horrific accident in which a railway tamping iron actually passed through his skull. Normally it is an accident, one should not survive. He did. But what struck 19th century Americans and Europeans were the dramatic changes in his personality. The thing is, Gage had been a very religious and humble man before the events which occurred. And after experiencing this cerebral trauma, he became, according to reports of the period, fitful, in other words, unstable, irreverent, profane, obstinate, capricious, and it seemed, and this is Victorian America and England, to have lost all inhibition, which is as bad as it gets in being antisocial, at least for the period. Then this triggered a popular sense, which eventually infected much of psychology, medicine, and psychiatry, that the relation between brain and mind was much more intimate than had ever been suspected before. And this led to a fundamental methodological problem, a problem in thinking, really, about the relation between the mind and the brain. A confusion between what we could call causation and correlation. Classical neurology, and basically this is what my father, who was a famous scientist, would tell me at the dining room table when I was a child. Classical neurology considered that changes in the brain led to changes in the mind. And as far as classical neurology, and this really goes up to the 1970s, was concerned, the brain was a frozen organ, pretty much from late childhood onwards. One experienced a steady loss of neurons, and this steady loss of neurons eventually led to senility and great old age. Neural pathways were definitely not reconstructed or not modified. Then this viewpoint has basically been turned heads over heels. We mentioned yesterday paradigm shift in physics. There has been a paradigm shift in neurobiology with the introduction of neuroplasticity, which came really from the research of Urbach-Hevita especially, and the theoretical work of Donald Hare on victims of strokes. So they found that stroke victims often were able to regain large amounts of the capacities they had before the stroke. This implies that parts of the brain are adapting and modifying, which is completely at odds with what was dogma, literally, in neurology up to that point. So neuroplasticity implies that changes in the mind can lead to changes in the neurological substrate. And neuroplasticity, that it's a plasticity of the brain, has really become the dominant viewpoint. There's a lot of data which corroborates it. So its pioneers go way back, but it had remained very much a minority viewpoint. Then what have been the models of mind-brain relationship? This is a famous Mongolian, he used to be called the Mongolian of the Turk. It was an automaton in the 19th century which played chess. It was the 18th century, so I was fascinated by machines which did what humans only could do. So this automaton played a remarkable game of chess. And it's only years after that it was discovered that there was basically a midget hidden inside it. It was a very good chess player. He played chess. So it's already in the 18th century that these big questions of what a machine could or could not do had arisen. Unfortunately, normal machines don't play a good game of chess, I can vouch for it. Computers is another story. Then there are two broad models of mind. The non-materialistic model of mind, which we would say was dominant really up to the 19th century, and the materialist model of the mind, which has become dominant ever since. Now, it is striking to see that eminent figures in Western philosophy and science subscribe to the non-materialist dogma or philosophy of mind. Kant, for instance, was probably the greatest philosopher Germany produced, and really the philosopher of the Enlightenment and modernity. Clearly subscribes to the non-material doctrine of the mind. So does William James, the founder of psychology in the United States, and a forgotten but important figure, F.W.H. Meyer. The materialist view of the mind, perhaps its foremost representatives nowadays would be Turing, the great British mathematician. Some of you may know of his work in cracking the Enigma code at Bletchley Park. He is one of the great figures in mathematics and philosophy of the 20th century. And John Searle, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the late 20th century. So the non-materialistic models of the mind were presented, I think, quite elegantly by Kant in his critique of pure reason. This goes back to the late 18th century. The body is not the cause of our thinking, but merely a condition which restricts thinking. And although essential to our sensuous and animal consciousness, may be regarded as an impeder of our pure spiritual life. This is basically the viewpoint which is prevalent in the West up to, I would say, 1850, probably. Things have greatly changed. Turing, we mentioned previously, seems to have considered that the mind was basically a computer and devised a test, the famous Turing test, to determine whether a machine was intelligent or not. Turing actually never addressed directly the issue of consciousness, but seems to have conflicted consciousness and intelligence. Now, the Turing test basically involved a double-blind situation in which one asks something on the other end of a screen or a room questions, and if based on the answers to those questions one is unable to determine whether that thing is machine or man, one is entitled to consider it intelligent. And there have been many critiques of Turing's tests, the shortest of which we owe to John Searle, a great American philosopher, the most articulate proponent of the non-materialistic view of the mind. Because whereas Turing views the mind as really the product of mechanical activity of the brain, John Searle's view is materialistic, but is much more subtle. For Searle, the mind is basically an emergent property of the brain. What he means by this is that even though without the brain there is no mind, the mind is not just the sum of the activities of all the neurons. Just as, for instance, if you take a molecule of water, you could not deduce the properties of water from the properties of the constituents of that molecule, hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen are gases. Hydrogen you cannot breathe, oxygen you can breathe, and it makes you a bit dizzy and eventually drunk. Then, if you put them together and you spark the mixture, and Stan, please, well away, because you don't do this. forget I mentioned sparking the mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. But in a laboratory, if you were to do this, you would have droplets of water. Now, hydrogen you cannot breathe, oxygen you can breathe, water you can't breathe. Hydrogen and oxygen you cannot drink at room temperature, water is a liquid, you can drink it. So suddenly, from two gases, you have a compound which has no relation whatsoever to these two gases. Water is an emergent property of hydrogen and oxygen. This is John Searle's view of the mind, and he takes odds with Turing's disciples, the holders of the computational theory of the mind, quite sharply. He accuses them basically of being materialistic theologians. And he says, I have encountered more passion from adherents of the computational theory of the mind than from adherents of traditional religious doctrines of the soul. Many people believe that somehow or other, unless we are proven to be computers, something terribly important will be lost. I never felt that way myself, but perhaps some of you feel that way. So, what would be, therefore, a materialist account of consciousness, no longer just of intelligence or memory, but consciousness? These accounts are surprisingly weak. This is a picture of Francis Crick, whom you know is the co-discoverer of DNA. And I suppose you could call him his disciple, Koch, who is the leading professor leading scientist and professor of neurobiology at Caltech. So Koch developed a model, a neurobiological model of consciousness And it considers that consciousness basically would be due to gamma band oscillations, in other words, electrical activity of the brain, which is coherent and synchronized throughout the brain. But it's worth pointing out that there's actually very little strong evidence for this. Yes, gamma waves are associated with consciousness. Whether coherent electrical activity of the brain is consciousness is very difficult to see. You have a clear case of confusion between causation and correlation. The presence of gamma waves when consciousness is present does not establish causation. It might establish correlation. We need much more to establish causation. And as we will see a bit later, there are a series of situations such as near-death experiences where consciousness is clearly reported and the EEG, the electroencephalograph, is flat. There is no electrical activity of any type whatsoever. Gamma delta theta, whatever. So what are the problematical issues for a materialist theory of the mind? And there is a lot of data I won't be able to cover all of it, so I'll present some points and hope some of you will further the research by yourselves. The first, which remains highly controversial, is the existence of single neural memories. We'll talk about this in a minute. It is the possibility for one single neuron to store memory. The second is extreme psychophysical influence, psychosomatic influence, leading to physical change in the body due to mental affects. The third, which I won't cover at all today, but it is very interesting, is the existence of savants or calculating prodigies, often autistic children who have phenomenal mental capacities which enable them, for instance, to extract the square root of very large numbers, to find prime numbers which are very large, and so forth. There's no clear explanation for these capacities at present. Then these, I would say, these first three cases are cases where more such phenomena could be compatible with a materialist account of the mind. Neurobiology at present is unable to offer any mechanism. Now, if you are a materialist, it behooves you to provide a mechanism. You can't just say this is due to the mechanical or electrochemical activity within an organ of the brain. You must explain how this is happening. Otherwise, your position is basically a dogmatic position. No mechanism is provided for this. Then the second group of three are highly problematic for materialist theories of the mind, and basically they can be accounted for. The first is verified near-death experiences we'll talk about later. These are near-death experiences in which the person has access, basically through what we would call paranormal capacities, to data there's no way they could know. The second is verified past life memories, verified cases of the reincarnation type, in which a child has memories of a past life, and these memories can be verified, and once again, it is material the child could not know. And the last, perhaps the most problematic, but I was very hesitant about presenting it here because it stretches the Western paradigm significantly, is cases of possession. Now, many of these cases are known as dissociative identity disorder in the West, and are basically not fully understood. So you will see, once we start entering into an assessment of the mind as a non-material phenomenon, that understanding DID as possession appears substantially more convincing. And I will try to make the case that a large part of modern psychiatry, and modern psychiatry really goes back to the 1850s, is rooted in ideology. It's rooted in ideology of the mind as matter. And we have interiorized this ideology to an extreme degree. And in some cases, specifically cases of dissociative identity disorder, if one approaches the data what the patient says, objectively, without any presuppositions. Possession by another spirit is a very convincing case. This is what the patient says. And this is, as you will see at the end of this conference, what just a naive person looking at the data would think. Then, not all of us, but most of us do acrobatics to try to avoid this one, because it involves shifting mental gears to a degree with which we are profoundly uncomfortable. But I thought I would mention it because this is something which is mainstream in Buddhism and Hinduism. And after all, if students come here and are interested in Buddhism and Hinduism, they have to be open to these possibilities. So, let us start with the least challenging bit, single neural memories. And I think we have one neurologist in the audience, so this is quite challenging, I think, for that neurologist. Then I have no particular claims of competence in the field, but I try to do a bit of background work. And we can't enter in detail in the biology of memory. I was going to do it, but there just isn't time. There's a marvelous review article of Eric Kandel in the third biography, Critical Critique of Materialism with Medicine and the Life Sciences. And it is, excuse me, yes, it is on page 3, Neurobiology and Cognitive Science. It's a review article. The biology of memory, a 40-year perspective in the Journal of Visual Science. I'd strongly recommend it to all of you. Kandel is one of the foremost researchers in the field. I think the biology of memory is not well understood. It's a work in process. And he basically, in this review article, tried to summarize what is known. This is important for us, because when we start dealing with cases of reincarnation in time, where a child remembers past lives, we have clear cases of memory without any material support for this. And this is something we have to try to account for. So neuronal memory was really postulated by a Polish neurologist, Józef Konowski, in the late 60s. There was no empirical evidence, but Konowski thought an individual neuron could store a memory. This was considered somewhat preposterous, to be frank with you. But Konowski was world famous, and it was left at that. Then, to everyone's great embarrassment, it's really, this one has been a very sensitive topic as far as I understand in neurology. Gabriel Kahneman, an Argentinian neurobiologist, a student of Koch at Caltech, found in his PhD thesis instances of what seemed to be neuronal memory. He found instances of cells in the amygdala which would respond to only one stimuli, and in this case, and I'm not making a political statement, but those of you who are labor don't see me as taking position for labor. These neurons, which are obviously very mistaken, would only respond to images of Bill Clinton. This is true. Then, what precisely was happening? This poor deluded patient had been so heavily indoctrinated by the democratic left that his mind, his neurons would respond to images of one of our most left-leaning presidents. There's no response. Kryman himself left Caltech to create a laboratory at Harvard. If you can imagine, in your 30s to be asked to create your own laboratory at Harvard, the Kryman Lab, which focuses exclusively on the investigation of single neural memories. And his mentor, Koch, has basically been backtracking ever since. And as far as I read it at present, the official account for single neural memories from Caltech is what is called, very euphemistically, sparse coding. Somehow, the neuron is not storing individual memories. Heaven forbid it should store the image of George Bush. It is storing a very, very compact form of coding this information. Because obviously, the basic problem with single neural memories is nobody has any idea of what mechanism might be used to store such information. And as we said, the materialist, this is really the petard on which the materialist is hoisted. The materialist must provide a mechanism. If you're going to say something is electrochemical or mechanical, you have to say how it is electrochemical or mechanical. And in the case of single neural memories, if Kleiman's research is corroborated, if his team has continued it, and they continue producing a very large volume of work, you can check it on the web if you're interested. There really is no mechanism at present. Then I would like to cover with you the second argument against the materialist theory of mind, which is psychophysical influence. And in this case, I thought I would take the case of the placebo effect. The placebo effect is an effect which is widely known in medicine. It is so widely known that every single test for a new drug is designed to eliminate the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a healing effect someone experiences when he thinks he's receiving medication. That's quite extraordinary. Because what is being said here is that medicine as a whole acknowledges an effect of the body on the mind which is so powerful, it heals the body. And instead of doing something with this, we design every single test for a new drug to not take it into account. It's silly, isn't it? Now, this is one lab at Harvard, the first to my knowledge, which actually is trying to use the placebo effect. And since one of the most endemic diseases, mental diseases in the West is depression, I thought I would show you a meta-analysis of antidepressants in clinical testing. Now, what you have in red here is the effect of the drug, the baseline initial severity of depression, and here you have the improvement in the patient. You will note that it is only with extremely severe cases of depression that there is a statistically significant difference between the effect of the drug and of a placebo. Otherwise, it is not possible, up to basically a baseline of 28 or so, to present any statistically significant difference between drug and placebo. In other words, placebos are bloody effective and cheap. It doesn't cost anything. Then, another recent review article in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, this is just a couple of years old, compares cognitive therapy, in other words, basically psychotherapy, meditation, mindfulness, any therapy involving the mind's action on itself, classical antidepressant medication, and placebo. Now you see that placebo at 25 is not effective in the long-term treatment of depression. But if you take antidepressant medication and cognitive therapy, in the long-term treatment of depression, cognitive therapy is more effective than placebo. Whether this is significant or not, I don't know, I don't have the data. Certainly we can say it is as effective. Now, how much money precisely goes in the development of antidepressant medication? And how much money goes in actually training the mind? It costs nothing. Right? And it is even more striking if you look at relapse, and this is where cognitive therapies really stand on their own. You can see that cognitive therapy, if it has occurred before depression, is far more effective than antidepressant medication in preventing relapse. Placebo seems quite ineffective in preventing relapse. Now, placebo and cognitive therapy are one and the same. It is the action of mind on the body in both cases. In the case of cognitive therapy, it's more analytical. In the case of placebo, we could say it's faith-based. So, there are some mechanisms provided to explain the placebo effect in the control of pain, the release of opiates in the brain. It's moderately convincing. Where there is no mechanism whatsoever provided is in the extreme cases of psychosomatic effects, such as this one known from the Lancet, in which a patient in a crisis of somnambulism, and this is due to the report of the patient after the event, recollected being tied up, and you can see the wheels appeared on his arm. And this is one of the very strong cases of psychosomatic effect. And as Stevenson points out, there is simply no mechanism in the present understanding of human physiology allowing for this to happen. There are accounts of letters appearing on people's bodies. I have no pictures for this. Then once again, there is no mechanism we know at present allowing the human brain to control, let's say just in the case of wheels, the human vessels, the blood vessels, and the muscles, such a degree. I should point out this was published in the Lancet, it's peer-reviewed, in 1946. It's called a reaction technique. Then, psychosomatic effect on such a scale cannot be at present explained by the materials. The next factor we should address are savants in calculating prodigies. I was going to cover this with you, but there just isn't time. There's some excellent books on the topic. I would heartily encourage you to read them. It raises a lot of questions about what precisely is not known about the functioning of the human mind. So these first three sets of data, which are at odds with the materialist account of the mind, are problematical for materialism because the materialist, as you see, cannot provide an explanation. There's no mechanism. With the following sets of data, the evidence runs directly counter materialism, and it has been extremely embarrassing for those scientists who have taken strong materialist stances. The first is a study of near-death experiences, and this is a picture of Bruce Grayson's meetings with His Highness the Dalai Lama. There was a conference held in Dharamsala 2 years ago. I was going to broadcast it at some time during the noon break, but there just isn't time. I think 2 conferences a day is really a lot for most people. But you can watch it on YouTube. I'd really encourage you to do so. Bruce Grayson makes a presentation in Dharamsala during one of the Mind and Life conferences on his research in the Division of Personality Studies at the University of Virginia. And he summarizes his data on near-death experiences, and he also summarizes his data on cases of the reincarnation type. And I think we have a case of the reincarnation type in the room right now on Aaron's lap. That has a connection. So, what are near-death experiences? Near-death experiences are not necessarily experiences which occur close to one's actual death. This is the first key point. These are experiences which can occur when one is physiologically close to death, but they can occur when psychologically one is convinced one is going to die. Even though one does not die and experiences no dramatic injury as a result. In either case, something happens which seems to lead the mind into overgear, and this overgear brings out capacities which are not present, or at least are only latent, in the ordinary state of the mind. Some of the best research in the field has been done at my alma mater, the University of Virginia, the Division of Personality Studies. These are some of the lead researchers in the field. Stevenson, whose main focus was cases of the reincarnation type, who is at present deceased. Bruce Grayson, who is head of the division, whose main focus is near-death experiences. Professor Jim Tucker, who has taken on Stevenson's research. And Edward Kelly, who has published, actually who is the editor of an exceptional work. And if there is one book I would recommend you to read, if you want to pursue your research, it is Kelly's book, Irreducible Mind, towards the psychology of the 21st century. On the third bibliography, the general section. It's a huge tome. It's some 800 pages. But if you really want to spend 1 year or so well, meaningfully for your practice, read this book. Kelly draws on the sum total of research which moots the point that the mind is material. Bibliography is huge. And it's a collective work. So he contributed mainly the section on F.W.H. Meyer's philosophy, but Bruce Grayson contributed data on near-death experiences and so forth. It is exceptional. There's no other word for it. It's not that expensive. So the collection of near-death experiences at the University of Virginia numbered 861 in 2007. It's increased since then, but the data is not published. I will mention it. Approximately 50% of the patients were in no danger of dying. So it's really a misnomer of these near-death experiences. We might want to call them stress of death experiences, or perhaps even high-stress experiences. It helps to think of them in these terms. Now, if we draw a typology of near-death experiences with two broad subdivisions, non-veridical and veridical near-death experiences. Non-veridical NDEs are basically subjective experiences. The person has experiences we'll be talking about in just a couple of seconds. The famous tunnel of light experience we have probably all heard about and so forth. But none of this can be verified. It's a private experience. May or may not be true. Veridical experiences are experiences in which the subject, for instance, sees car plates on the street, knows where things which were hidden are placed, travels to other rooms and sees things he or she is not supposed to see and could not see. And this is verified by interrogating or questioning witnesses. Now, near-death experiences have a variety of features, and not all are universal. Basically, I drew on Grayson's work. There's very little statistical breakdown of this material, simply because there's very little funding for this research. So this is very old work, but it comes from Grayson's work, and if you're interested in near-death experiences, the best reference is Grayson's The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, published by Prager in 2009. It's an expensive book, it's some $50–60, but it's a very serious scientific presentation of the material. There's a lot of, how shall we say, there's not a very exorbitant material out there, let's put it that way, because near-death experiences are seen as proving a lot more than they do prove. But the basic problem is, to be taken seriously in this field, one does have to follow certain scientific guidelines. And Bruce Grayson does, and other authors like Sam Ponya and Pim van Longer also do. So in the case of near-death experiences, all these features can be present. Altered time, thought processes, life review, sudden understanding, peace, light, joy, cosmic unity, out-of-the-body experiences, enhanced sensory experiences, ESP, precognition, visions of another world, encountered beings, mystical beings, and points of no return. But some points are present in more than 50% of the cases, and this is my analysis. The first is an altered sense of time. The second is a strong sense of peace. The third is a sense of joy and cosmic unity, and out-of-the-body experiences where one leaves one's body, or one feels one leaves one's body, are highly present. And then experiences of another world are also present in more than 50% of the cases. In these experiences are transcultural. There are other elements of near-death experiences which are culturally bound. For instance, the famous tunnel of light everyone has heard about from Rudy's research is culturally bound. Westerners experience it. Indians and Thais do not. There's been a study of Indian and Thai near-death experiences. Indians and Thai experience the judgment after death by Yama. Westerners do not. These seem to be culturally bound experiences where one's religion, one's culture influence what one experiences. But the features mentioned up here are not culturally bound. Generally, there are, and it's been a taboo topic for a long time, not all near-death experiences are good, far from it. Then the research in frightening near-death experiences has really only taken off in the last 20 years. I won't talk about it here. There have been clear accounts of near-death experiences involving encounters with what seems to be hell beings, basically. Then there's been a systematic taboo against this, both from the standpoint of the researchers and those who experience this. The researchers come to near-death experiences with certain biases. Typically, they want to hear nice stories, let's put it that way. And those who have experienced being dragged downwards by hellish beings